Okay, it looks like most people have joined us, so I am going to get started. Hello everyone, I am Chantal Smit from Blue North, and I have got some colleagues with me. So you'll see Amber on your screens, and then also Eddie, and then Anal as well. So just some quick housekeeping. So you should see something similar to what you are seeing on this slide. So you will notice that you are not able to unmute yourself. So the mic would be grayed out. However, we have allowed the cameras. So it's completely optional if you would like your camera to be on or off. It just makes it a little bit more interactive. So you're welcome to, click on and off on your camera. And then two important icons that you can use to communicate with us throughout the webinar would be to raise your hand. So that's this little hand icon that you should see at the top of your screen. That will basically just grab our attention, and then Amber will unmute you and allow you to actually use your mic if you would want to ask a question in that way. Your other option, which is the one that we would recommend and which would be a little bit easier to manage, is the chat box. So I see there's already some messages in the chat box, so please feel free to put any comments or questions in there. Amber has already put something in there just so that you can locate where that is. So just to give you some background about who is Blue North and just the relationship between Worldwide Fruit and Blue North. So for those of you that have not engaged with us before, Blue North is a sustainability consulting company which was started in 2011. So we have got expert knowledge and a lot of experience focusing on sustainability in the agricultural value chain. So that's really the area where we specialize. And we have been assisting Worldwide Fruit with sustainability matters since 2019. So sustainability is very important to Worldwide Fruit, and they've been doing a lot of work in this regard over the years. So on this slide, you can see some key examples of the work that we've been involved in. So it includes water stewardship work, a lot of work with Sherpa, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a sustainability management online tool. And then more recently, a lot of work in the carbon space. So what is the purpose of this webinar today? So there's a lot happening and changing in the carbon landscape. And it's really important to just be aware of what is happening and really just to be informed, because it changes and there's a lot of updates. So the purpose of today or of this webinar is really to give you a complete introduction and very nice overview of a variety of different topics, all surrounding carbon and climate change. And then secondly, we also would want to just quickly touch on a carbon roadmap. So this is a plan to help you navigate this complex carbon space. Okay, so let's get started. So the webinar is basically divided into 4 different sections. So firstly, we will really start at the basics. So we'll look at the carbon cycle, just explaining what is the carbon cycle. Then we will cover carbon emissions. So what is the impact of carbon emissions, and really looking at this problem around carbon emissions. Then the third part would go into carbon reduction. So how can we start thinking about reducing carbon emissions? And then finally, as I mentioned, we would also just like to cover a carbon roadmap and what is a carbon roadmap and how can you get one in place for your organization. Okay, so starting with the carbon cycle. So how does the carbon cycle work? So there is a natural cycle on Earth where carbon flows between different pools. So each pool has got its own complex system, and I'll just talk through it, just explain it in a little bit more detail. So right at the top, you can see there's the atmosphere. So we can refer to this as the atmospheric pool. So this one is very important because the accumulation of carbon in this pool is what causes climate change. So we'll talk a little bit more about climate change in a bit more detail in the next section. But basically the carbon in this pool, in the atmospheric pool, absorbs solar energy, and this creates the greenhouse effects. The second pool is what we refer to as the oceanic and the water bodies pool. So this is a very large pool. It's actually larger than the atmospheric and vegetation pool, and it plays a very important role in regulating the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So yeah, it actually delivers a very important service to us, but this service comes at a cost, because if there's too much carbon dioxide in the ocean, this causes ocean acidification. Then looking at the vegetation pool. So this is carbon in the tissues of all vegetation. So plants, trees, wood, for example. So as plants grow, they are basically grabbing carbon from the atmosphere during a process called photosynthesis, and then they use this to grow and fuel themselves. So that's the exchanges that is happening in the vegetation pool. Then right in the middle, we get the soil carbon pool. So this is basically carbon bound in the soil system. And then we, on the left-hand side, we get the carbonate rocks pool. So yeah, it basically takes a very long time for these rocks to form in marine shallow environments. So a very good example of carbonate rocks is lime, which is commonly used in agriculture. And it gives the ability to neutralize acidity. Then finally, we get to the fossil fuel pool. So this includes coal, natural gas, crude oil, which we refine into petrol, diesel, and also plastics. So that is basically a very simplified summary of the carbon cycle. And in most pools, carbon does not just sit still. It's constantly reacting and being transferred between different pools. So what is important to understand around the carbon cycle is that certain pools serve as long-term carbon sinks. So it takes considerable time to accumulate and retain the carbon in these pools. So two examples is the carbonate rocks pool and the fossil fuel pools. So when we extract carbon from these pools, it really disrupts the balance of the carbon cycle by affecting the other carbon pools. So once the carbon is released, it mainly accumulates in the atmosphere pool or the atmospheric pool. So, and this really leads to a very big imbalance, contributing to this rise in global temperatures and really intensifying climate change. So just to summarize some important points around the carbon cycle. So carbon is, you can think of it as this energy currency of all natural systems. There's a natural carbon cycle with continuous exchanges. The fossil fuel pool is a locked away storage pool. And once the fossil fuel is burnt, it can hardly ever return to its prior storage pool, but it goes into other storage pools, typically the atmosphere. And then lastly, overburdening the carbon cycle has led to this accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this is causing climate change. So that wraps up our first part of the webinar. So that was really just a brief explanation about the carbon cycle and how that relates to climate change. We are now going to move over to talking a bit more about carbon emissions. So we've divided this part of the webinar into three subsections. So firstly, we are going to look at climate change in a little bit more detail. Then secondly, we will move over to talking about global action. So this is really looking at the question, how's the world responding to climate change? And then lastly, we will end off by talking a bit more about carbon footprinting or carbon emissions measurement. Okay, so when we spoke about the carbon cycle, we emphasized that there's this natural carbon cycle, but there's definitely a very big imbalance caused by the burning of fossil fuels, and this is causing this accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we can clearly see a very strong correlation between the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere and rising global temperatures. So this increased carbon dioxide traps more heat, which leads to global warming, which in turn causes various impacts on climate patterns. So yeah, that's basically an explanation of climate change and how the things link to each other. So when we look at this graph, yeah, it's just indicating this correlation between the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and rising global temperatures. And there's very sophisticated climate models that can give us some useful predictions into the future. And those models predict that once we reach around 500 ppm or parts per million, which is just the unit of measure of the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So once we reach around 500 ppm, they predict that there will be no more climate regulation. So this is, of course, a very worrying prediction. So people sometimes dismiss climate change as just a natural change or natural changes. But it's important to understand that there is long-term natural changes, but these are much slower. The current rate of change that we are seeing is much faster than any climatic change in the history of the planet. So carbon dioxide levels have not been at this level in the last 2 million years. And there are natural influences and fluctuations, but these natural influences, for example, in the sun and volcanic activity, it causes only a very small amount of temperature changes. So the scientific community really is without a doubt that the current carbon dioxide concentration and this imbalance is really due to human activity. So it can't just be explained by a natural flux. So why are we worried about an increase in global temperature? The effects of climate change will include, it's not just an increase in temperature, it will include more frequent and severe weather events, sea level rise, loss of biodiversity, and disruptions to ecosystems, and a lot of negative social consequences as well. And a lot of you might be aware that we are already seeing a lot of these negative consequences today. So that's really, what the problem is around climate change and why everyone is so worried. So how's the world responding to this? So we mentioned, that there's a lot of negative consequences associated with climate change. And of course, we now understand why this is causing a very big concern globally. So this has resulted in international commitments to solve this issue, to really combat climate change. And this brings us to a very important piece of legislation, which is the Paris Climate Agreement, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. So this is a legally binding international treaty on climate change, which was adopted by 196 parties at COP21. So COP is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And don't worry, the United States and China is part of the 196 parties that signed this treaty. So the goal of this Paris Climate Agreement is to limit this rise in global temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is now compared to pre-industrial levels. So that's the goal, but what is important to understand is that even at a 1.5 degree warming, so even if we do achieve this goal, there is still going to be a lot of negative consequences associated with this increase in temperature. So on the graph or on the bottom of the slide, you can just see some predictions from one of the IPCC reports. So you can see at a 1.5 degree warming, there will be large-scale drought, heat stress, species die-off, loss of entire ecosystems, and again, a lot of social consequences along with this. So the hotter it gets, the worse these consequences and factors will be. So it's really important to note, to make it even worse, this is global average temperatures. In certain locations, it will be far more extreme, which is going to result in very dramatic changes in parts of the world, even if we do reach the goal of 1.5 degrees increase. So the key message in all of this is that we are literally playing with fire if we underestimate or ignore this goal that is being set by the Paris Climate Agreement. So how are we going to achieve this this very big goal that is set globally? So we will need to reach net zero. So this could be another word in the carbon space that you commonly hear in recent times. So what does this mean? So net zero is basically where there's no more emissions being added to the atmosphere than what we are removing. So only at this point does this trend of increasing global temperature actually stop. So it won't reverse back to previous temperatures, it just stops increasing. So it's really important that we reach this point as soon as possible. So this graph that I'm showing on this slide, it's giving a very good outline of how emission reductions and removal should work together. So the main priority should really be rapid reductions in carbon emissions, and then the removals component is there to complement this. So removals cannot replace emission reductions or emission cuts that is necessary. We are currently emitting far more emissions than what we can possibly absorb back again. So removals are specifically there to offset the emissions that just cannot be feasibly reduced. So it could be where the technology just simply, it either doesn't exist to reduce them yet, or it just is impossible to not have these emissions occur in the first place. So an example could be if we are going to continue wanting to just have cows on the planet, they will always be having methane emissions going into the atmosphere. So there will always be a little bit of emissions, and that's the role of removals. But focus should not be taken away from large emission reductions that really is needed. So now that we've got an idea of the scale of this challenge that we are facing, it's really clear that very ambitious targets around carbon emission reductions is needed to really make any meaningful change. So this is where something like the Science Based Targets Initiative can play a very important role. So some of you might have heard of this. And just to explain what that means. So a science-based target is a greenhouse gas emission reduction target that is in line with the latest climate science to limit global warming to a 2-degree increase. So it's basically helping organizations to set targets that is aligned to meeting the Paris Agreement. So science-based targets is really becoming the way to report emission targets and to make commitments. So importantly, these reduction targets and commitments, if you sign up for the Science Based Targets Initiative, they need to be publicly communicated, which makes it very transparent. and companies can be held accountable. So more and more companies are really starting to set targets. So this is leading to a lot of pressure that a lot of people are feeling and a lot of organizations are feeling. So it's leading to increasing pressure around really measuring and also reducing emissions on this journey to achieving net zero. So this graph on this slide is showing the increase in the amount of net zero targets being set. So you can look at it at different levels. It's at it's nations setting these targets, states and regions, cities, and then also companies. So there's a lot of pressure. This pressure is coming from both sides. It's coming from legislation, originally from the Paris Climate Agreement, and then also from the bottom up, as more and more consumers and NGOs are driving climate action, and they really are holding organizations accountable. So often the pressure originates from large corporations, and then it cascades down through the supply chain. So big companies are really under scrutiny for climate disclosures, emission reduction goals, and ESG reporting, which really makes them much more visible to consumers. So when a retailer establishes a net zero target, it's really only a matter of time before their suppliers feel the effects of these actions. So it's really becoming the new normal. Okay, so how do we get to net zero? So how can we achieve this? So importantly, it's really a long-term process that you need to follow. It's not going to happen overnight, and we've broken it up into these 4 different steps or stages. So the first and probably your most important step is really the measurement component. So really measuring and understanding your carbon emissions, know what you're working with, because this is really going to inform the rest of the journey. So you cannot start looking at setting targets if you don't have a good idea of your emissions and your hotspots and where to focus. So then, so measuring and understanding, definitely your first step. You would start looking at setting targets. So that's where something like science-based targets could, or science-based targets initiative could help. And then, of course, your third step would be to reduce your emissions, and then looking at carbon removals only to complement your reduction efforts, and only for that little bit of emissions that's not feasible to reduce. And then this will ultimately help you to reach net zero. But just as a final point, you'll notice that arrow going back to your measurement component. That's just because the measurement component really should be something that's continuous. You would need to remeasure once you've implemented some actions to know and understand what effect did any reduction actions have on your carbon emissions. Okay, so we've mentioned that the first step in this journey to net zero is really the measurement component. So that brings me to the importance of calculating a carbon footprint. So there's really so many factors to consider when looking at the importance of a carbon footprint. But it's really clear that this is not something that's going to go away. So you are not ahead of the curve if you are measuring your carbon footprint anymore. You are actually behind if you are not doing it. So we can, go through some of the points on this slide. So I have mentioned some of them, but just to re-emphasize, mandatory reporting is really becoming relevant. It's actually becoming a retailer expectation that carbon footprints are calculated, and that of course relates to really just building trust. Then there's the point around the rising input costs. So diesel, fertilizer prices, it's constantly on the rise. And these inputs are typically your big hotspots in a carbon footprint as well. So if you can really get to a point where you are measuring this so that you can manage it, you are actually going to see that you're saving costs. So then, of course, this links to profitability. And I've also now touched on the point in the middle, just around not being able to manage what you don't measure. And then, of course, just being ahead of the curve and really being proactive to take control of this agenda and really minimizing impacts and mitigating risks early on. And then the final point to mention around calculating a carbon footprint is really just to talk about this increasing sustainability awareness. So this is really a trend that we are seeing around the world. So you can see on this slide, I'm just showing a few outcomes or the results from a very big survey that was done. So it clearly emphasizes this increase in sustainability awareness amongst consumers. So, for example, one of the results showed 78% of consumers really feel that sustainability is important to them. So this actually provides a opportunity to access this market and really market your products as sustainable. But care must really be taken to back any claims that's being made. So there's a real risk of greenwashing. So this might be another word that you have been hearing in the carbon world. So greenwashing simply means that you are making statements without really having the evidence to back it. So it could be unintentional in some cases. So the way to really stay clear of this is to make sure that you've got credible data to back up any claims. So this brings me to, just talking about some resources and tools available around primary data collection. So it's really all about getting your data collection systems in place because evidencing sustainability is really becoming a data-driven exercise. So there's a lot of tools and resources out there that can help you with this data-driven exercise. So I mentioned Sherpa previously that some of you may have come across working with Worldwide Fruit. So Sherpa is an online sustainability management system, and it basically helps helps organizations to capture environmental and also social and economic data, which in turn assists you to develop and implement your sustainability goals. Then more carbon specific, we are very involved with CCC, which is Confronting Climate Change. So this is specifically for calculating a product carbon footprint. So this would specifically relate to capturing all data related to the production of a specific product. So some of you may have recently been part of the process where it was also through Worldwide Fruit, where they helped some of their suppliers to calculate the product carbon footprint of one of their farms. So then they would have calculated or measured all the greenhouse gas emissions directly involved in the production process. So CCC, just to mention, CCC follows a internationally accepted methodology called PAS 2050. So we also ensure that we remain current with any advancements in PCF measurement, and then we would adjust CCC to match the prevailing global standard. So the reason I'm sharing this information is it's just important to get your data collection tools in place, and also just make sure that it's a credible tool that you are using. So getting your data in place is definitely not always easy. There's a lot of challenges to collecting primary data. and it can, in some cases, be a long-term process. So typical challenges that are experienced includes it being time consuming. It can be a complicated exercise. You might not feel like you've got all the data available, or you might just don't, or you might not think it is necessary. So luckily, the amount of solutions and resources out there is really is much more than the challenges that you would encounter. And again, if some of you on the call might have been involved in this process with Worldwide Fruit, you would have really experienced a lot of support provided to calculate a product carbon footprint. So this could have been, would have been through workshops or a support desk. In some cases, there would have been a data entering service, so just sending the records to us. If you're not yet ready to go on an online tool, then we do it for you. So that's really a resource in Blue North that is there to make this process really as painless as possible. There's also a sense check or a review support component. So that is really where we help the person entering the data or completing the data set to really identify any gaps and work with them to make sure that it's actually a complete data set and accurate data set. Because, of course, bad data in is going to equal bad results and not really meaningful. So, we really do provide a lot of support, and we've got years of experience with carbon footprint data collection, specifically in agriculture and on farms. So we really do know how to best support to make the process as painless as possible, while you really can get a credible and accurate result. So we also work internationally. So there was quite a few cases where we would just get a translator in the call, in a workshop or a training workshop or a training call. So if language is a barrier or a challenge, then we can also provide a solution to that. So other points to mention on the solution side. You might not feel like you've got all the data available, but my advice to you would be to just get started. So getting to a really accurate and complete carbon footprint, it really does take time. It gets exponentially easier as long as you just get started. So really just start somewhere. Don't delay the process too much to try and get a perfect carbon footprint your first time around. And then just around not thinking it is necessary, it really is something that is just a matter of time before the pressure is on everyone to really start measuring and getting plans in place to reduce their emissions. So we are keen to just hear from you if there's any barriers to measuring a carbon footprint that I may have not mentioned on my slide, or you could just, even if it was on my slide, just to kind of confirm what your organization's biggest barrier to measuring a carbon footprint is. So we'll do this in the form of a word cloud. So I see Amber's launched it. So you can just enter your response, and then we'll just pause here for a second. Okay, thank you to everyone that's already responded. Yeah, I'm just going to read out some of the most common answers. So information is a big one. Yeah, I'm assuming that it's perhaps just the feeling of not having all the data together. So yeah, definitely just to mention again, my advice would be really just get started. There's ways and means to go about it. So if you can just start by capturing data around your hotspots, what we call, so that's basically your biggest contributors to your carbon footprint, and we can help guide you with what that is. Then you are already on your way to having a good carbon footprint. So yeah, don't let that delay the process. I would urge you to really just get started. Okay, there's quite a lot of other responses. So yeah, it's a lot around data and also just time to get the exercise done. Okay, is there any questions at this stage? I see there's some activity in the chat box. So just let me know if there's anything we need to discuss further before I continue.
There's no current open questions, Chantel, so we can continue.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eddie. Okay, I am going to go over to the next slide, but you are welcome to, okay, I see the poll is closed. So if you want to get rid of it, you just click on the little X and then that takes it away. Okay, so just to wrap up the carbon emission section, just to give a little bit of a summary around key messages. So it's clear that there's a very strong link between human-caused carbon emissions and climate change. So we are already experiencing the consequences of climate change, but these will intensify as the global temperature gets hotter. The Paris Climate Agreement is a very essential piece of legislation binding countries to reach net zero. Net zero is a long-term journey, and your first step is really the measurement component. Then reducing emissions can correlate to reduce costs and also lower market risk. Then pressure to report and reduce emissions is really pushing down from retailers and brands onto suppliers. And then there is this opportunity for sustainable products, but extreme care must be taken to stay clear of any greenwashing traps, even if it is unintentional. And then lastly, just to emphasize the importance of getting good data collection systems in place. So that wraps up the carbon emissions section of the webinar. So we are now going to move over to carbon reductions. So this is a short section and it's just looking a little bit more around how can I reduce my emissions. So this is what we call our action plan. So this is basically just to share some information around how organizations can make the link between the measuring and the reducing component of a carbon footprint. So it would typically look something like starting at step 1, which would be getting all your data together. And as we saw in the word cloud now and the slides that I also went through, this is typically your most difficult step. So yeah, again, I would urge you just to get started, and I yeah, also just want to mention that it really does get easier the second time around. So step 1 is all about getting your data together. Then you would need to calculate a carbon footprint. Just make sure that you use a credible tool, and also just make sure that there's some kind of a data quality check, just because, yeah, bad data in is going to give you bad or unusable results. So that's step 2. Then step 3 would really be to go and look at the information in your carbon footprint report. So this would be where you actually start understanding your emissions better, and then it would move over to step 4, which is where you can identify the hotspots. So I've mentioned this a few times. It's really where you want to be guided by where to focus your attention. So that would be step 4. And then, of course, step 5 would be where you would actually investigate specific ways to reduce your carbon footprint, focusing on your hotspots, because that's going to make the biggest impact when you start looking at carbon reductions. And then step 6 would be to actually just manage the implementation of any carbon reduction actions. So this could be in the form of new practices or new technologies, if the budget allows. And that brings you back to step 1, because you would then typically be doing a carbon footprint yearly. It should be a continuous or an annual exercise. And we always recommend, and the protocols also say, that you actually need you need to measure your carbon footprint for 3 years in a row to really understand and get a good picture of what your carbon footprint looks like. Especially in agriculture, it's very relevant because, of course, there's seasonal fluctuations influencing a carbon footprint. So when we look at how can growers be supported to make carbon reductions, awareness raising and the education component is very important. So there's a lot of pressure around this, as I've mentioned in my previous section. And and for an organization to be forced to do something if they really don't understand it is a bit, is unreasonable and is going to be counterproductive. So education and joining webinars like this is really important. And then to support measurement is also a very important point to mention. So this goes hand in hand with perhaps providing technical solutions, so carbon footprint tools to the supply base, and then lastly to communicate carbon reduction success stories. So when we look at mitigation options or carbon reduction options, we can look at some options available to farms and pack houses, for example. So you can see I've just divided this into typical options that would make sense for a farm versus a pack house or a cold store or a winery, or the distribution component of a carbon footprint. But the message here is that the different options or actions that you take to reduce your carbon footprint is really going to differ in their impact, but it's also going to differ in their feasibility. So this is really just because each organization is unique and it's got its own operational circumstances. So the detail on this slide is not too important. It's really just to bring across the message that context is key when you start thinking about carbon reductions. And the more effort you put in the measuring component and understanding your emissions, the better your reduction actions will be, because you really need to make it specific to that organization and take into account the specific circumstances of the organization. So some key messages is that your first step when starting to look at carbon reductions is really to know what you are working with. Then to use available tools to measure your carbon footprint, and that should really guide your emission reductions. Then always start with your hotspots. So targeting these will really make the biggest impact. Also look at targeting efficiencies in resource use, as this will usually lead to cost savings. Then just to mention that carbon reductions, it's a long-term strategy. And in certain cases, it could actually require significant structural changes in a business. It could require investment and new technologies. And then lastly, just continue monitoring to really test the success of any changes made. So always loop back to that measurement step to really inform how successful was your carbon reduction actions. Okay, so we've now covered the carbon cycle, the carbon emissions section, and then also carbon reductions. So we are going to go over to the final component of the webinar, and that is looking at a carbon roadmap. So a very basic carbon roadmap can really help guide your efforts in the carbon space. So it could be very overwhelming and you don't know where to start. Then a carbon roadmap, really going through that exercise is the perfect thing to help you. So a carbon roadmap is basically a strategic plan to guide efforts in reducing your carbon emissions over a specific time frame. So there's a lot of different ways to approach a roadmap, but to just give you a basic example, it can be divided into 4 main stages. So you would have a commitment component, so that would be your starting or your first phase, and that's really all around getting carbon policies and strategies in place. So really committing to taking control of this agenda. Then you would move over to a measuring component. So this would be really measuring your own emissions and also downstream, and really understanding what are you working with. And then after that, you would typically look at target setting. So that would be your next component of your carbon roadmap. And then lastly, there would be actions relating to reduction, carbon reductions. Okay, then just to mention, Worldwide Fruit is going to help 20 suppliers to develop carbon roadmaps with the help of Blue North. So if you would like to be part of something like this, then please just indicate that on the feedback form that you will receive at the end of this webinar. So we will put it in the chat box right at the end. I've just got a few more slides and then we'll share that with you. And then you can indicate that this is something that you're interested in. So my next slide is just to give you an idea of how that would work. So what process to follow to for us to help you get a carbon roadmap in place. So it would firstly just involve getting some information from you. And don't worry, this is nothing like a product carbon footprint. It's a much simpler exercise. And I'll show you after the slide exactly what information is going to be required. So that's step 1. Then we will review that information. So it's really just a few dates. So it's just assigning dates to actions. And we will then structure that into a logical carbon roadmap. So we'll really help you and structure all the different plans so that at the end you've got something like this example. This is just Worldwide Fruits example. A roadmap can run up to 2050. It doesn't, it can, this is really just to show you or to give you an idea of the output and, to show you what that could look like. So, as I said, I would like to just very briefly show you the type of information if you want to take part in this exercise. So, you'll see the Excel document on my screen. So it's really, very plain and simple. It's just got different tabs. And all you would need to do is just assign a year to any option that is, or any action that is relevant to you. So if something is not relevant, then you would just select the NA and not applicable option. But it should not take too long. There's not a lot of years to assign, and you're also welcome to provide any additional options. Something that might be in your company's plans, but it's not listed here, then you could add that. That is what this exercise would entail. Okay, then just to end off the webinar, Amber is going to put the feedback form in this chat. And I would really want to just urge you all to just take a few minutes just to give us some feedback. And then, of course, also indicate if you're interested in a carbon roadmap exercise. then we know that. And I'll also email the slides and the recording and the feedback form to everyone that signed up after the webinar. And then lastly, while everyone is opening up the feedback form, I would just like to mention that Blue North is going to be at Fruit Attraction a little bit later this year. So if anyone in the audience plans to attend, it would be lovely to meet you in person. So yeah, on the next slide, I will show our email address. So you are welcome to contact us and yeah, send us a note if you're planning to be there, and then we could definitely meet up. So that is the end of the webinar. So yeah, we've definitely got some time. If there's any questions or any comments, please put it in the chat box.
Hi, Chantal. There's a question from Simon about the common barrier that is data for growers, and he's asking if a grower has, most of the data needed to calculate the carbon footprint, how long would one expect it to take to transfer the data into a carbon footprint?
Okay, thanks, Simon. That's a good question. It is a little bit tricky to answer. Just we might need a little bit more information. But from your message, it sounds like they've got the big hitters. I mean, which would typically be fuel and electricity and your fertilizers. So it sounds like they've got all the hotspot data. And if there's any challenges regarding how to input the data, so there's components where you might need to split some of the data, there we can definitely help and speed up the process working with the farm or the organization. So yeah, how long to transfer the data? Not too long. If to give you a rough estimate on CCC, if someone has got all the data available, it takes 30 minutes to enter the data onto the system and get your carbon footprint report. Of course, then there's the review component, which should definitely be done. But yeah, that would be my take. Eddie or Nel, any additional comments?
No, all that I would say is for corporate carbon footprint, if you have those, if you have the data, it's all about just entering it into a calculator. And at the time with the product carbon footprint, it can take slightly longer with the allocations. But as you said, we can support that, and they also have the data entry service that I think you mentioned previously earlier, Chantal.
I'm always the one taking a little bit more of a conservative approach. So I would say the first time you do it, you're going to figure out your data might look a little bit different from what we're asking you. So there's a bit of figuring out. So it might take you longer. It could take you, if everything's ready, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours. But we know from interviews just on confronting climate change that people that do this regularly, there Chantal's correct, half an hour, 45 minutes, once a year. So it becomes almost like a habit. So it does become easier. But maybe for the first time, brace yourself for a little bit longer, but it's not days.
Chantal, I see an interesting question here from Nick, just asking, is there a global standard, or who determines if a carbon calculating tool is credible? Do these tools follow a standard set of rules? Yes, Nick, definitely they follow a standard set of rules, and there's two main standards out there, or types. So one is a product carbon footprint, and there's ISO methodology, so you can follow PAS 2050. Is something that the Carbon Trust follows, and that we've built into our tool. So that's a very credible standard. So normally when you get the tool, they should make it clear what standard they are following. And then in terms of corporate carbon footprinting, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate carbon footprint would be kind of the gold standard in terms of determining that. So any tool should state which one of, if it's product or corporate, and which methodology it is following.
Great, thanks, Eddie. I hope I haven't missed any questions, but I see the next one on my list. Sorry, Anel, do you want to add?
No, go ahead.
The next one is from Charlie. So just he or she said, as a grower, I feel I'm already doing the minimum possible tractor activities, minimum chemical fertilizer activities, etc. What is the area growers can reduce their carbon usage without risking the quality of the crop? I'll give my answer, and then any of the Blue North colleagues can add if I missed anything. But my opinion on that is it goes back to my key message around the reductions. It's really difficult to make specific recommendations without really having a nice detailed carbon footprint and understanding a bit more context around the farm. There's very general recommendations, like switching to solar and those type of things. But if you really feel like you are doing quite a lot already and you need more specific guidance, I would kind of get some farm on the ground specific actions.
Yeah, I can maybe just add to that, Charlie. So there's 3 big hitters at a grower level. It would be diesel use for your tractors, electricity, and fertilizer. In terms of electricity, I don't know where you are based. I assume it might be the UK. The UK's got is increasingly the grid network is becoming more green, so that should almost automatically be coming down. If you're in South Africa, then you've got a fantastic opportunity in terms of PV installations that packhouses and growers are installing to reduce the carbon footprint there and also save money in the long term. It does take a bit of an investment up front. So that, on the electricity side, is almost the easiest one to tackle. On diesel, there's a lot happening. Well, firstly, newer equipment. If your tractor is 20 years old, in terms of the latest tractors and technologies and turbos and stuff that's in those tractors, they are more fuel efficient. But there's a lot of happening in the biofuel space. Second and third generation biofuels, it's still more expensive than normal fuel, but that is changing, and the volumes and the availability of that is picking up as that market is maturing. So that is something to kind of look out for in the near term. Where possible is looking at the electric vehicles. Again, it's the prices of that is coming down. It's not there yet, and not all activities at the farm level you can use an electric vehicle, electric tractors or anything like that for it. Sometimes you have to revert to a fuel-based tractor, but that's again something to look out for. And then lastly is fertilizer, which is probably the most difficult one. There are greener fertilizers and ways of producing fertilizers with green energy or green hydrogen. They call it green ammonia, using green ammonia to produce fertilizers. Again, that's something that's probably still a few years off, but that will have massive carbon savings in terms of that fertilizer. So a few options, some easier than others.
I can maybe add one more, Eddie. You've covered it well, but the last one that you can add that would also impact your chemical and your fertilizer use is really looking at regenerative agricultural principles. You are perhaps already doing that, but thinking around soil health specifically, and the use of cover crops to reduce your fertilizer use. And that's a whole package of things. I've just mentioned a few. There's a whole lot that you can do with regenerative agriculture.
Right, thanks, Anel. We've got a question here. Which carbon calculator would you use? If it's a product carbon footprint, I would use CCC. I think there's fantastic support and good value for money in terms of using that tool. There are also other tools out there that you could research. For a corporate carbon footprint, I would use something like Sherpa. If you are up for a challenge, you can also download the standards. It's wordy documents, but the methodology is not complicated, and it could also be something that you kind of put together for your organization if you do have the resources in place for that. But yeah, for that I would go CCC or Sherpa, depending on which one.
Okay, great, thanks, Eddie. The next question is at what point does a farm's footprint end and becomes the next organization's responsibility?
Good. I can take that one. So for product carbon footprint, you measure the carbon footprint over the supply chain. So you would definitely cross boundaries, and you would probably be working the farm and the pack house and the importer and the exporter. They would kind of be working together to determine what that product carbon footprint is. If you're only doing a portion of the product carbon footprint, then the boundary ends with you. You'll say, if you're a farmer, my farm gate is my boundary where I'm going to stop measuring, and I will pass that information on to the pack house, and they can add their bit, and so it will move through the supply chain, and you will build that picture of the product's carbon footprint. If it's a corporate carbon footprint, you determine your organizational boundary up front. It's very similar to your business boundary. If you've got a holding company, then you will do it at that level. If you only have a private company, your own farm, then that would be your boundary for a corporate carbon footprint.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eddie. Then what do you think about biochar production from pruning wood as a carbon removal tool?
The biochar is mentioned in the latest greenhouse gas protocol and SBT methodologies and standards. So we haven't done any projects or pilots on it, but it's definitely acknowledged in there. I think it's something that we probably need to do a bit more research in. I'll company it before I just can give you an opinion exactly on that. But I do know it's in there and it's being acknowledged, and the people are working with it.
Okay, I hope I didn't miss a question, but that seems to be the last one on the list. If there's any more, feel free to put it in the chat.
Willie's made a comment, and maybe we can respond to the comment, and that's just a lot of unsupported calculators being out there, and support and guidance does seem necessary. Shall I go,
Definitely.
Chantel? Yes.
I'll say something, and then if you want to add anything, you're welcome. We obviously do a lot of work in CCC. So our day-to-day jobs is working with farmers to complete their carbon footprints in CCC. Most of the time, we catch something in the review part. So it's just illustrating the support and guidance aspect is really, really important. So again, I'm going to say what I said in the webinar: bad data in, bad results out. So I would really support Willie's comment, just the risk of that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chantel. And being there and having the support if you're doing it for the first time, I think really helps, that it's not so overwhelming, because it's something, anything that you start off with that's new can be a little bit overwhelming. But the support goes beyond just entering data in the tool. We do support a lot around thinking around carbon emissions, carbon reductions, how to improve data quality, what systems would be applicable to your specific context in your organization. So there's a lot of advice that's being provided on the journey. So I think that's a crucial aspect of what CCC offers.
Thanks, Anal. Okay, then I just see a question around measuring carbon sequestration. Eddie, if I can give that one to you.
Yes, so carbon sequestration, the term that we use there is carbon removals. Again, there's a new guidance and a methodology that came out from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol around that. And then Science Based Targets is also initiative has also released guidance on FLAG, which is forestry, land and agriculture, and it acknowledges the carbon removals component. I must just it's exciting because yes, you can report that separately from your emissions, and you can you could offset the one from the other. I must just warn everybody that it's quite not onerous, but it's a very credible methodology, and the requirements to meet that is quite high in terms of the soil samples, the amount of soil samples, breaking it up into groups. You need to show a statistical significant reduction in carbon before any removals can be claimed. It's also if those removals are reversed, then you've got to do it annually, and you've got to report those reversals as well. So very rigorous, very good methodology. But in terms of the soil testing, it's you need to have your ducks in a row, and your records needs to be right. And in terms of biomass for the actual tree, there needs to be approved and peer-reviewed models for that specific cropping system in that specific region. There's a lot of universities doing work around that, but you'll probably have to go and search. Is there a model that accurately estimates and it's credible the amount of carbon that's in my trees? And then those carbon pools can be recorded. And if those carbon pools, if there's a significant increase in that carbon pool, in other words, you've removed carbon from the atmosphere, then yes, you can report on that. It's Lottie, sorry. It's just to note that is very different. It's different from carbon credits. You can't sell a removal. A carbon credit you can sell to somebody else, and once you've sold a carbon credit, then you can't claim that removal at all. That would be double counting. So you almost need to choose which direction you would like to go.
Okay, I don't see any other comments or questions. If there's nothing else, then yeah, that is basically the end of the webinar. You are welcome to send us an email if any questions come up afterwards. The email is shown on the slide. But yeah, just to say from my side, thank you so much for joining, and yeah, hope that you have a great rest of the day.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.